Good morning, I'm Morgan, a Morgan Downer Sewing Party, and this is video number 3, showing how I make this 16th century dress. In the previous videos, I showed the patterning, then the construction of the bodice. In this one, I'm going to finish it up by doing the skirt and the hoops. The pattern for a farthingale skirt is actually quite simple. It's an A-line skirt and consists of 2 rectangles and 4 triangles, with a little bit of waist shaping. The 16th century Alsaga pattern here shows one way to lay out the pattern for efficient cutting. There is some debate as to where you should attach the triangular gores, but I decided to go with what made sense to me, which is rectangular sections in the front and the back, and 2 gores on each side at your hips. It's generally a good idea to attach your bias edges to straight grain edges so that the bias can't stretch over time, so that's also what I did. I pin all of the skirt pieces together to make sure that I have the layout how I want it, and then machine sew those seams. This is a pretty clear image right here of what I'm doing. You're going to want 2 of those guys. Now I can try on the skirt, but the waist is a little bit big, so I've done some temporary gathering in the back and a little pleating on the sides to keep it from falling down. The bodice from part 2 comes back on now, and once I get everything tightened up, I can tuck the skirt up underneath the bodice and mark out where the waist seam will be with some chalk, especially in the front where the point is. With the skirt flat, I can use my chalk marks and the little dots here to determine where the center line for the skirt of the waist will be. It'll need to open up a little bit down the front, so next I'll split the skirt down a couple of inches on the center. First, I make a facing out of some scrap fabric and mark the center of the facing with chalk. Pin the facing in place on the front side of the fabric and sew around that drawn line very close to the edge, maybe a 1/4 inch out. Then I cut between those 2 seams right on the chalk line and flip the facing in towards the inside of the skirt. All of the raw edges get turned in and pinned to keep everything in place. With a little bit of off-camera hand sewing, that facing is neat and finished, and the waist seam can also be finished with some more whip stitches. I try to keep my stitch on the front side of the fabric as tiny as possible to help keep them invisible once it's worn. Now we can attach the skirt to the bodice. I use lots of pins to keep everything centered in the front and back, and then evenly pin the rest of the skirt fabric onto the waist of the bodice. This is pretty similar to cartridge pleating, but I'm not pleating the fabric first, so maybe cartridge gathering? Whatever you call it, this sewing is definitely best done by hand, and I gather the skirt's fabric slightly between each stitch to make up the excess, especially towards the back of the garment where it's got a lot of pleating. When this is done, it'll have a really nice gathered effect on the outside. The skirt is falling nicely from the bodice, so we can go ahead and start hemming. Normally, a friend would be a really helpful thing to have here, but since I'm working alone today, I'm just going to have to take up the bottom hem as evenly as I can while wearing it, and then adjust as needed afterward. I got these flat spring steel bones on Amazon to use as hoops. It's hard to see if the skirt is too long without it being properly expanded to its full circumference, so I'm inserting the spring steel into the pinned hem. This is only temporary though. When I tried the dress on again, I was a little alarmed at how big the skirt was. But instead of panicking, I decided to spend some time in the outfit to see how I feel about it before making any drastic changes. I want to see if the length of the skirt will bug me as I walk around and if the fit of the bodice works for me. This is my first time wearing a hooped skirt, so I also want to get a sense of how annoying it's going to be to walk through doorways, sit down, and generally go about my day and events. So I'm going to take a break from sewing and spend some time around the house, getting coffee, doing some dishes maybe, some reading. Alright, and the results are in. I've decided that while the hem seems to be even enough, it is a little bit too long because I kept on stepping on the bottom hoop. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut it right here at the bottom of the currently pinned hemline, which will both even it up and shorten it by about an inch. I also feel like it's definitely wider than I would like, so I'm going to pin out some darts in the middle of each gore. I'm removing about a total of 12 inches from the hem. I will make the seam allowance narrower as I reach the top of the skirt, since I don't really want to remove much width in the hip area. That area is already pretty good to go. Now that the skirt is fixed, I can start creating channels for the hoops. I'm cutting long strips of bias tape from the silver silk fabric. I'm using this handy dandy card, I think it's a gift card, to mark down the same width down the length of the strip. The illustrations of 16th century hoop skirts often show bands of contrasting color holding the hoops, and I really like the look of that. Connect your strips of bias, and be careful as you pin. You don't want to accidentally flip which side the seam allowance is on. One side of your tape should be nice and smooth, and the other will have many little flappy seam allowances to iron down. I'm going to attach a band to the hem of my skirt and finish the edge of the hem at the same time by sewing the silk band on the inside of the skirt and then flipping it up and out so it shows on the outside. Basically, I'm making a facing, except it's going to be on the outside instead of the inside. With the help of a ruler and an iron, I'm getting everything neat so that I can pin the new band in place. To figure out the placement of the next row, I measure approximately where I would like it to be and then add a piece of tape to my ruler so I can very quickly keep that same distance between rows throughout the entire band and all the subsequent bands. It's a little bit faster than looking at a number each time you want to measure something. I will generally sew one edge of a band or guard on the machine, and then after it's been ironed and pinned, I'll hand sew the other edge of the band. This way I avoid any visible machine stitching on the outside of my historical garment. If I wanted to go the extra mile, I would hand sew both edges of the skirt, but I don't have time for that today. I left a couple of inches open on each channel so that I could still insert the spring steel hoops. Once I insert some hoop, I cut the excess off and tape each end so that those sharp edges don't poke through my fabric. There are more professional ways to finish the edge of steel, but tape will work for now. The steel needs to overlap by at least several inches so that they'll keep a round shape in the skirt. If you cut them too short, they'll form sort of a pointy teardrop shape instead. Now that all the hoops are in, let's see how things look. Alright, not bad. The narrow width is definitely better, and the overall size looks pretty good. The back of the hem is touching the ground a little bit, and the front could also be a little higher as well. The top hoop is a tiny bit too big at the moment. See how it sort of sticks out a little bit more than the rest? I'll need to reduce the size of that hoop and then tape it in place. Rather than make a new hem, I'm going to reduce the length of the skirt by taking a tuck a couple of inches up from the top hoop. Tucks are really great because it means that, one, I don't have to undo all that work I did on the bottom hoop, and there's lots of visible tucks on dresses in 16th century portraiture. Perfect. I'm using the ruler to mark out the depth of the tuck and then pinning it in at the base. A little bit more off-camera sewing and ta-da! All done. Enjoy some photos and footage of the finished farthingale. Next, I'll be making a red gown to go over this. Until next time, good night, guys!